The espresso cup left my hand before my brain could catch up with my rage, and I watched, almost in slow motion, as it arced through the air of Dante Moretti's pristine corner office, the dark liquid trailing behind it like a comet's tail, before the entire thing exploded against the imported Italian marble wall, with a sound that seemed to echo through every floor of Moretti Industries, and possibly through the entire financial district of Manhattan. The silence that followed was so absolute, so suffocating, that I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears like a war drum, counting down the seconds until the most dangerous man in New York decided exactly how he was going to make me pay for what I had just done. And honestly, in that moment of crystal-clear insanity, I found that I didn't care anymore because 3 years of swallowing my words, 3 years of perfect service, 3 years of watching him treat people like chess pieces and women like disposable pleasures had finally, irrevocably, completely shattered whatever professional composure I had spent so long building. I had arrived at the office at 6 in the morning, just like I had every single morning for the past 1,095 days, my keycard granting me access to the executive floor before even the cleaning crew had finished their rounds, and I had gone through my routine with the kind of mechanical precision that comes from endless repetition, brewing his espresso exactly the way he liked it, 3 shots with just a whisper of foam, organizing the stack of contracts that needed his signature in order of priority, checking his schedule for the day, and cross-referencing it with the schedules of every other person he would be meeting to ensure there were no conflicts, no surprises, no inconveniences for a man who had built an empire on his ability to anticipate every possible outcome and eliminate any variable that didn't serve his purposes. My hands had been shaking as I worked, exhaustion creeping through my bones because I had been at the office until midnight the night before, helping him prepare for a merger that would expand his legitimate business holdings, while simultaneously, though he thought I didn't know, providing perfect cover for moving his family's less legal operations into new territory. And I had gone home to my tiny studio apartment in Queens, collapsed on my bed still wearing my clothes, slept for exactly 4.5 hours before my alarm screamed me back into consciousness, and I dragged myself through a scalding shower, and back onto the subway, and back to this gleaming tower of steel and glass and secrets. But it was when I opened his personal calendar, the one that only I had access to because he trusted me. God, he trusted me, to manage every aspect of his life, that I saw the entry that made something inside my chest crack clean through. Sweet meeting with Adriana, 3 p.m. I knew exactly what that meant because I had seen this pattern play out dozens of times over the years, the beautiful women who would appear on his arm for a few weeks, or maybe a month if they were particularly entertaining. The ones he would wine and dine and take to charity galas where cameras would flash and society pages would speculate. And then the sweet meetings would begin appearing on his calendar. Those afternoon appointments in the executive suite on the floor above his office. The one with the private entrance and the California king bed and the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Central Park. And I would know that he was done with them, that he was extracting whatever final pleasures he wanted before he discarded them like expensive tissues, usually with a generous severance gift that ensured their silence and their swift departure from his life. I had watched this cycle so many times that I should have been numb to it, should have been able to maintain the cool professional detachment that had made me the best executive assistant Dante Moretti had ever had. But something about seeing Adriana's name in that time slot made my vision blur red, because Adriana was different. She was a kindergarten teacher from Brooklyn who had met Dante at a charity event for children's literacy. And she was sweet and kind, and genuinely seemed to believe that underneath the sharp suits and the dangerous reputation, there was a good man waiting to be loved into redemption. And I had listened to her gush about him in the elevator 2 weeks ago, her eyes shining with hope and possibility, completely unaware that she was just another conquest, another notch, another woman who would learn the hard way that Dante Moretti didn't do redemption or love or anything that required him to be vulnerable for even a moment. So when he strode into the office at exactly 7:30, looking devastatingly handsome in a charcoal gray Tom Ford suit that probably cost more than my monthly rent, his dark hair perfectly styled, his green eyes sharp and assessing as they swept over the room before landing on me with the kind of casual attention he might give to a familiar piece of furniture. I felt something savage and reckless unfurl in my stomach. He had moved to his desk with that predatory grace that made him seem more like a panther in human skin than an actual man. Settling into his leather chair and extending his hand for the espresso I had prepared, expecting me to place it in his palm, the way I had done every single morning for 3 years without fail. And I had picked up the cup, had walked toward him with steady steps, had seen him already turning his attention to his computer screen because I was that reliable, that invisible, that completely beneath his notice as anything other than an extremely efficient tool for managing his empire. "Your schedule is relatively light today," I had heard myself saying, my voice coming out remarkably steady considering the storm building behind my ribs. "Just the board meeting, at 9, lunch with the Castellano representatives at noon, and then your sweet meeting with Adriana at 3. I had watched his expression as I said her name, watched for any flicker of conscience or hesitation or recognition that he was about to break a genuinely good person's heart. But there was nothing. Just a slight nod of acknowledgement as he reached for the espresso cup that I was still holding. And that's when whatever fragile thread had been holding my composure together finally snapped. The cup had left my hand with all the force of 3 years of suppressed frustration, 3 years of watching him use and discard people, 3 years of being treated like a sophisticated piece of office equipment rather than a human being who had sacrificed sleep and health and any semblance of a personal life to make sure his world ran smoothly. And the satisfaction I felt watching it shatter against that pretentious marble wall was so intense it was almost frightening. Dante had frozen, his hand still extended where the cup should have been, his eyes tracking from the coffee dripping down the wall to my face with an expression I couldn't read. And then the door to his office had burst open, and 2 of his security team had rushed in, hands already moving toward the weapons they kept concealed under their jackets. But Dante had raised one hand in a gesture that stopped them as effectively as if he had erected an invisible wall, and he had never taken his eyes off me, not for a second. "Leave us," he had said, his voice carrying that tone of absolute authority that made grown men who ran criminal enterprises scramble to obey. And his security team had hesitated for just a fraction of a moment before backing out of the office. And then Dante had stood from his chair with movements that were deliberately slow and controlled, had walked to the door, and had locked it with a soft click that seemed to reverberate through my entire body. "You have exactly 10 seconds to explain," he had said, turning back to face me. And there was something in his voice that I had never heard before, something darker and more dangerous than simple anger. "Before I show you what happens to people who disrespect me in my own office." But I was beyond caring about consequences, beyond caring about the fact that this man could destroy my life with a single phone call, beyond caring about anything except finally saying what I had been thinking for so long. "I quit!" The words had torn out of my throat like they were ripping flesh on the way out, and I saw his eyes widen just slightly. The first genuine surprise I had ever managed to provoke in him. "I quit being your perfect little assistant who schedules your meaningless meetings and manages your revolving door of women, and pretends not to notice that half your business deals are fronts for activities that would make the FBI very interested if they knew exactly what I knew. And I quit watching you treat people like they're disposable, like they don't have feelings or hopes or dreams that matter, like the only thing that exists in the entire universe is Dante Moretti and his empire and his pleasure and his convenience." I was breathing hard, my hands clenched into fists at my sides, and Dante had started moving toward me, circling around his desk with steps that were so measured and predatory that I felt like prey being stalked. But I refused to back down, refused to show the fear that was dancing along my spine, mixing with the adrenaline and something else. Something hot and dangerous that I didn't want to examine too closely. "You're going to use Adriana this afternoon just like you've used every other woman who's been stupid enough to think you might actually care about them. And then you're going to discard her with the expensive bracelet or whatever your going rate is for salving your minimal conscience. And she's going to be heartbroken because unlike your usual type, She actually believed in you, actually thought that maybe you were capable of being something more than a beautiful monster in an expensive suit. My voice had risen with each word until I was nearly shouting, and I could see something flickering in his eyes now, something that looked almost like fury but darker, more complex, laced with what might have been fascination. And you know what the worst part is? I had continued, unable to stop now that I had started, words pouring out of me like water from a broken dam. The worst part is that I've enabled all of it. I've been complicit in your moral bankruptcy because I needed this job, needed the money for my mother's medical bills and my student loans and the 1,000 other financial obligations that keep me chained to this desk. Watching you destroy people and doing nothing except making sure your calendar is perfectly organized while you do it. I had seen his jaw tighten at that, seen something flash across his face that looked almost like recognition, and he had stopped circling, was standing close enough now that I could smell his cologne, something expensive and woodsy that probably cost more than my entire wardrobe. "Is that everything, Elena?" he had asked, and hearing my name in his voice, actually, my name, not Ms. Martinez, or just a gesture in my direction, had sent a shock through my system, because I wasn't sure he had ever actually used my first name before, and there was something in the way he said it that made it sound like a caress and a threat all wrapped together. "Have you finished your tantrum? Or is there more you'd like to throw at my walls before we discuss what happens next?" "What happens next is that I walk out of here and never come back," I had said, but my voice had lost some of its conviction, because the way he was looking at me now was different from any way he had ever looked at me before, like he was actually seeing me as a person rather than a function, and it was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. "You can find yourself another assistant to facilitate your emotional destruction, someone who won't develop the inconvenient problem of a conscience. You're not going anywhere, Elena," he had said, and the certainty in his voice had made my breath catch because this wasn't a request or even a command. It was simply a statement of fact, as if my departure was not even a possibility he was willing to entertain. "Do you want to know why?" He had taken another step closer, close enough that I would have had to tilt my head back to maintain eye contact, close enough that I could see the flecks of gold in his green eyes, could count his individual eyelashes if I wanted to. "Because in 3 years of employing you, I've learned everything there is to know about you. I know about your mother's lupus and the experimental treatments that insurance won't cover. I know about your night classes toward your MBA that you think I haven't noticed you're taking. I know about the $900,000 in medical debt that keeps you awake at night. And I know that you have exactly $47 in your checking account until your next paycheck clears." The room had started spinning slightly because he shouldn't know those things. I had been so careful to keep my personal life separate from work. But of course he knew because Dante Moretti didn't employ people without knowing every detail of their lives, every pressure point he might need to exploit. "So here's what's going to happen," he had continued, and there was something in his voice now that was almost gentle, which somehow made it more frightening than if he had been angry. "You're going to take the rest of the day off to calm down and reconsider your very dramatic resignation. And tomorrow morning you're going to come back to this office at 6 a.m. just like always, except things are going to be different because I'm going to make you a new offer. Double your current salary, full coverage of your mother's medical expenses, including the experimental treatments, and immediate enrollment in the executive MBA program at Columbia, with all costs covered." I had opened my mouth to tell him exactly where he could put his offer, but he had held up one finger to silence me, and the gesture was so commanding that I had actually stopped talking, hating myself for the automatic obedience. "But in exchange," he had said, and now there was something almost predatory in his smile, "you're going to become my personal assistant, not just my executive assistant, available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, accompanying me to all of my meetings, including the ones that involve my other business interests. And most importantly, you're going to stop pretending that you don't feel something when you look at me, because I've seen the way your pulse jumps in your throat when I get too close, the way your breath catches when I say your name, The way you watch me when you think I'm not paying attention. The accusation had hit me like a physical blow, because he was right. God help me, he was right. And I had spent 3 years carefully burying the unwanted attraction that had sparked to life the first day I met him. The complicated tangle of desire and disgust that came from wanting someone I knew was fundamentally dangerous. That's not. I had started to protest, but he had moved even closer. Close enough that I could feel the heat radiating from his body. Close enough that when he spoke, his breath ghosted across my lips. Don't lie to me, Elena, he had murmured, and there was something almost tender in his voice that made it so much worse than if he had been cruel. I've watched you for 3 years, studied you, learned every micro-expression and every tell, and I know that you hate yourself for wanting me. Hate that you're attracted to exactly the qualities that your conscience tells you to despise. But the wanting is there nonetheless, isn't it? His hand had come up to trace along my jaw, a touch so light it was barely there, and I had shivered despite myself, despite knowing that this was dangerous, that letting him see my reaction was giving him exactly the weapon he would use to destroy me. I don't want your servitude, Elena, he had continued, his thumb brushing across my lower lip in a gesture that sent electricity shooting down my spine. I want your fire, your passion, your brilliant mind that sees patterns and solutions that even my most experienced advisors miss. And yes, I want your body trembling under mine while you moan my name, but more than any of that, I want you to stop pretending that you're just a secretary when we both know you're so much more than that. He had pulled back slightly, enough that I could breathe again, could think again, and the smile on his face was knowing and dangerous, and absolutely certain of victory. So here's my final offer. Be at my penthouse tonight at 8 p.m., and we'll discuss the terms of your new position in my life. Or don't show up and I'll accept your resignation, pay out your remaining vacation time, and you'll never hear from me again. And if I choose to leave? I had managed to ask, though my voice sounded weak and thready even to my own ears. Then I'll respect that choice, he had said, but there was something in his eyes that suggested he already knew what I would decide. But you and I both know that you won't, because despite your very impressive moral outrage, you're curious now. You're wondering what it would be like to stop fighting against what you feel and just surrender to it. And that curiosity is going to eat at you until you show up at my door just to see what might happen. He had stepped back then, creating distance between us, and had straightened his tie with casual precision, as if we had just concluded a normal business meeting, rather than whatever the hell that had been. 8 p.m., Elena. Don't make me come find you, because if I have to hunt you down, the consequences will be far more intense than if you come to me willingly. And that's how I found myself now, 6 hours later, standing outside Dante Moretti's penthouse building in Tribeca, with my finger hovering over the call button. My heart hammering so hard I thought it might actually break through my ribs, knowing that if I pressed this button, everything in my life would change in ways I couldn't even begin to predict. But also knowing that he had been absolutely right about one thing. The curiosity was killing me. The need to know what he meant by all those loaded words and heated looks was overwhelming every bit of common sense I possessed. And as I finally pressed the button and heard his voice come through the intercom saying, "I knew you'd come, Tesoro," I realized that maybe I had been his from the moment I threw that coffee cup. I just hadn't been ready to admit it until now. The elevator that carried me up to Dante's penthouse was the kind of obscenely luxurious private lift that only existed in buildings where apartments started at $20 million. All dark wood paneling and soft golden lighting that made me look flushed and nervous in the mirrored walls. And I watched my reflection as we ascended. Watched the way my hands trembled slightly even though I had clasped them together to hide it. Watched the way my breathing was too fast and too shallow. Watched the woman in the mirror who looked like me, but was making decisions that the Elena Martinez of 3 years ago would never have recognized or understood. I had told myself during the entire subway ride from Queens that I was only coming here to properly resign, to tell Dante Moretti face-to-face and outside the power dynamics of his office that I would not be manipulated or seduced or whatever it was he thought he was going to accomplish with his loaded words and knowing looks. But even as I rehearsed the speech in my head, I knew I was lying to myself because there was a reason I had gone home and showered and changed into the one dress I owned that made me feel beautiful, rather than just professional. A deep emerald green that brought out the amber flecks in my brown eyes and hugged my curves in ways that my conservative work clothes never did. The elevator doors opened directly into his penthouse. Of course they did, because Dante Moretti would never live anywhere that required him to stand in a common hallway like ordinary mortals. And I stepped out into a space that took my breath away, despite my determination not to be impressed by his wealth and power. The entire far wall was floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the Manhattan skyline, the city spreading before us like a kingdom of lights and steel. And the interior was all dark masculinity and understated luxury, leather and wood and art that I was fairly certain was not reproduction pieces, but actual originals that probably cost more than most people earned in their entire lifetimes. And, standing in the center of it all, backlit by the glowing city behind him, was Dante himself. And he had clearly come home and changed as well, because he was no longer wearing the armor of his business suit, but instead was dressed in black slacks and a black dress shirt with the sleeves rolled up to his elbows, no tie, the top 2 buttons undone to reveal the strong column of his throat, and the casual elegance of it was somehow more devastating than seeing him in full boardroom regalia. "Elena," he said, and there was something in his voice that made my name sound like a prayer, or possibly a claim, and he crossed the space between us with that predatory grace that I had noticed 1,000 times before, but which now seemed charged with entirely different meaning, because we were no longer in his office where professional boundaries could provide at least the illusion of safety. "I'm glad you came, though I confess I'm not entirely surprised. You've never been the type to leave questions unanswered or curiosities unexplored, which is one of the many things I've always admired about you." He stopped just close enough that I could smell his cologne mixed with something else, something that was uniquely him. And I hated that my body responded to his proximity with a rush of heat that pooled low in my stomach and made my breath catch in a way that I absolutely could not hide from someone as observant as he was. "I came to tell you in person that I won't be manipulated," I managed to say, though the words came out far less firmly than I had intended, colored by the breathlessness that his presence seemed to provoke in me against all my better judgment, and deeply held convictions about not getting involved with dangerous men who treated people like possessions. "Whatever you think is going to happen here, whatever game you're playing with your cryptic comments and your job offers, I'm not interested in being another one of your conquasions." I stumbled over the word slightly, my tongue thick in my mouth. "Your conquests. I mean, another woman who falls for the illusion of intimacy with Dante Moretti, only to discover that you're incapable of actually connecting with another human being on any level that matters." Something flickered across his face at that. Something that looked almost like pain if I hadn't known that he was far too controlled and calculating to allow genuine emotion to show, unless it served his purposes. And he gestured toward the dining area, where I could now see that he had set a table with what looked like an actual home-cooked meal, which was so unexpected that I actually felt my carefully constructed argument starting to crumble, because this wasn't what I had anticipated, wasn't the seduction scene or power play I had prepared myself to resist. "I made dinner," he said, and there was something almost tentative in his voice that I had never heard before, an uncertainty that seemed completely at odds with the man who commanded criminal empires and corporate boardrooms with equal authority. "Nothing fancy, just pasta carbonara, because I remembered you mentioning once, about 18 months ago during a particularly late night at the office, that it was your favorite comfort food, but you never had time to make it properly anymore." The fact that he had remembered such a small, throwaway comment from over a year ago did something complicated to my chest, made it hard to maintain the emotional distance I desperately needed to preserve if I was going to walk out of here with my dignity and my moral high ground intact. I found myself moving toward the table almost against my will. drawn by the unexpected domesticity of the gesture, and the growing realization that maybe I didn't actually know Dante Moretti as well as I thought I did, that perhaps the mask he wore in his office was only one facet of a far more complex person than the two-dimensional monster I had constructed in my mind to justify my anger and my attraction in equal measure. He pulled out a chair for me with old-world courtesy that seemed ingrained rather than performed, and as I sat, I caught his expression in the reflection of the window and was startled by the vulnerability I saw there, quickly masked, but definitely present. A crack in the armor that suggested that maybe, just maybe, he was as affected by whatever was happening between us as I was, even if he was far better at hiding it behind centuries of Italian masculine stoicism and the emotional control required to survive in his particular world. "Why are you doing this?" I asked as he poured wine into my glass. Some ridiculously expensive vintage that I could tell from the label probably cost more than my monthly rent. And I hated that I was already starting to lose my resolve, already feeling the careful walls I had built between professional duty and personal desire beginning to erode under the unexpected tenderness of his attention. "This morning, you were ready to blackmail me into staying with threats about my financial situation, and now you're cooking me dinner and pulling out chairs like we're on some kind of normal date rather than two people engaged in whatever complicated psychological warfare this actually is." Dante settled into the chair across from me, and the city lights behind him created a halo effect that made him look almost angelic, which was such a contradiction to everything I knew about him that I might have laughed if the situation hadn't felt so surreal and charged with possibility. "Because I've been lying to myself for 3 years," he said, and the raw honesty in his voice made me forget about the wine, forget about the food, forget about everything except the words coming out of his mouth and the way he was looking at me like I was something precious and dangerous all at once. "I told myself that keeping you at arm's length was protecting you from my world, protecting you from the corruption and violence and moral compromise that defines my existence. But the truth is, I was protecting myself from you, from the way you make me want to be something other than what I am, from the terrifying realization that you're the only person in my entire life who sees me as a man first and a monster second, if you see the monster at all beneath the surface." I took a long drink of wine because I needed something to do with my hands and my mouth that wasn't either running away or doing something incredibly stupid like crossing this table to touch him and confirm that he was real, that this conversation was actually happening, and not some elaborate fantasy my exhausted brain had constructed during the subway ride. "I see the monster," I said carefully, because lying to him seemed pointless when he had already demonstrated an almost supernatural ability to read my thoughts and feelings. "I see the way you use people, the way you calculate every interaction for maximum advantage, the way you've built an empire on fear and violence and the willingness to do things that most people couldn't live with on their conscience, but I also see the man who anonymously pays for his employees' medical expenses when they're struggling, who has personally bankrupted 3 human trafficking operations in the past 2 years, even though it cost you profitable business relationships, who reads philosophy at 3 in the morning when he thinks no one knows he's still awake because I've seen the browser history on your personal computer when I'm setting up for early meetings." The look of absolute shock on his face would have been comical if the moment hadn't felt so raw and exposed, as if we had both suddenly stripped away layers of pretense and protection and were seeing each other clearly for the first time, despite working in close proximity for 3 years. "You've been paying attention," he said, and there was something almost wondering in his voice, as if the idea that someone might observe him with the same intensity he observed others was a completely foreign concept. "You've been watching me the way I've been watching you, collecting data, building a profile, trying to understand what makes me tick beneath all the carefully constructed personas." "It's impossible not to watch you," I admitted, and the wine was making me braver, or possibly just more honest than wisdom would dictate. "You fill every room you enter, command every conversation, draw the eye even when you're trying to be subtle. And yes, I've spent 3 years trying to reconcile the contradiction of a man who can order someone's death before lunch, and then spend his afternoon personally reviewing scholarship applications for underprivileged kids, because he believes education is the only real path out of poverty. I set down my wine glass and met his eyes directly, refusing to look away, even though the intensity of his gaze made me feel like I was standing naked in front of him, every secret and desire exposed to his examination. But watching you and understanding you are two very different things, Dante. And I'm not sure anyone really understands you because you've spent your entire life making sure that no one gets close enough to see the man underneath the legend. He stood abruptly, moving to the window with his back to me, and I watched the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands clenched and unclenched at his sides, as if he was fighting some internal battle that I couldn't see but could feel charging the air between us with electricity. My father used to say that showing weakness was the fastest way to get killed in our world, he said, his voice low and rough with what might have been old pain or present conflict. He taught me from the time I was old enough to understand that emotion was a liability, that caring about people gave your enemies weapons to use against you, that the only way to survive was to be harder, colder, more ruthless than anyone else. And I was a very good student, so good that by the time I was 25 I had eliminated every rival, consolidated power, and built an empire that even he couldn't have imagined. He turned back to face me, and in the dim lighting I could see something haunted in his expression, something that spoke of costs paid and prices extracted from his own humanity. But then you walked into my office 3 years ago with your ridiculous overqualifications and your determination to prove yourself. And you looked at me like I was just another executive you needed to impress rather than the devil incarnate that everyone else sees. And something in me that I thought I had successfully killed started to wake up again. I stood as well, unable to remain seated while he was clearly in the grip of some revelation or confession that was costing him more than I had imagined he was capable of paying. And I moved closer to him, drawn by something I couldn't name but couldn't resist. Some fundamental need to understand this man who had occupied my thoughts and invaded my dreams for 3 years, despite my best efforts to maintain professional boundaries and emotional distance. "What are you saying, Dante?" I asked, and my voice came out barely above a whisper, because suddenly the space felt too intimate, too charged, too full of possibility and danger in equal measure. "What do you actually want from me? Because I don't think this is really about being your personal assistant, or accompanying you to meetings, or any of the practical things you mentioned this morning. This is about something else entirely. Something you're afraid to name directly because naming it would make it real, and real things can hurt you in ways that your father's lessons never prepared you for." He closed the distance between us in 2 strides, and suddenly his hands were framing my face with a gentleness that contradicted everything I knew about him. His thumbs tracing along my cheekbones as if I was something infinitely precious and breakable, and when he spoke, his voice was raw with emotion that I had never heard from him before. Emotion that made my heart stutter and my breath stop completely. "I want you to know me, Elena. Not the reputation, not the legend, not the monster or the businessman, or any of the 1,000 masks I wear to survive in the worlds I inhabit. But me, the man underneath it all who reads Seneca at 3 in the morning and lies awake wondering what it would be like to be good. To be worthy of someone who looks at the world with your clarity and your compassion and your absolutely terrifying integrity." His forehead dropped to rest against mine, and I could feel him trembling slightly. Could feel the monumental effort it was costing him to be this vulnerable, this honest, this completely exposed. "I want you to see all of me. The violence and the tenderness, the calculation and the impulse, the darkness and the desperate wish to find some light, and I want you to decide if there's anything in all of that worth saving, worth caring about, worth taking a chance on even though I can't promise that I won't hurt you, or disappoint you, or drag you into situations that your conscience will struggle with." The kiss that happened next I couldn't have said who initiated, whether I had risen on my toes to close the distance or he had bent down to claim my mouth. But suddenly his lips were on mine and the world exploded into sensation and heat, and a rightness that terrified me even as it made something in my chest that had been clenched tight for 3 years, finally, blessedly relax. He kissed me like he was drowning and I was air, like he was starving and I was sustenance, like he had been waiting for this moment for as long as I had been denying I wanted it. And I kissed him back with 3 years of suppressed desire and complicated feelings pouring out through the press of lips and the slide of tongues, and the way our bodies seemed to know exactly how to fit together, even though we had never done this before, had never crossed this line that I had drawn so carefully between what was professional and what was personal. When we finally broke apart, both breathing hard, his eyes were almost black with desire and something else, something that looked like wonder mixed with terror, and he rested his forehead against mine again, as if he needed the contact to ground himself in reality. "Stay," he said. And it was the first time I had ever heard him ask for something, rather than demand or command or manipulate. And the vulnerability in that single word did more to break down my defenses than all of his earlier calculated seduction attempts. "Not for sex, not yet. Although God knows I want you more than I've ever wanted anything in my entire life. But just stay. Talk to me. Help me remember what it feels like to be human, rather than the thing I've turned myself into for survival." His hands slid down to grip my shoulders. Not hard enough to hurt, but firm enough that I could feel the leashed strength in them, the control he was exercising over impulses that I suspected were urging him toward far more aggressive claiming. "I know I have no right to ask this of you. No right to pull you into my world or expose you to the dangers that come with being close to me. But I'm asking anyway, because apparently you've destroyed whatever remained of my self-control and my better judgment. And all I know is that when you walked into my penthouse tonight, wearing that dress and looking at me like I might be worth salvaging despite all evidence to the contrary, I realized that I would do absolutely anything to keep you here, to make you understand that what I feel for you is nothing like what I've felt for any of the women whose names you've so carefully scheduled and dismissed from my calendar over the years." I should have said no, should have recognized that this was exactly the kind of emotional manipulation I had accused him of earlier, should have walked out the door and never looked back, because getting involved with Dante Moretti in any capacity beyond professional was quite possibly the worst decision I could make for my safety, my sanity, and my soul. But instead I heard myself saying something that I knew would change everything, would open a door that could never be closed again, would commit me to a path that I couldn't see the end of, but somehow desperately wanted to walk anyway, despite all the warning signs screaming at me to run in the opposite direction as fast as my legs could carry me. "1 month," I said, and I watched his eyes widen slightly at my words, at the unexpected capitulation that even I hadn't seen coming until it was already out of my mouth. "You have 1 month to prove to me that you're more than the monster everyone says you are. 1 month to show me that this isn't just another game or manipulation or whatever twisted thing you think you're doing here. And if at the end of that month I decide that this is real and worth the risk, then we'll talk about what happens next." The smile that spread across his face was unlike any expression I had ever seen him wear. It was pure, unguarded joy, mixed with something that looked almost like relief, and it transformed him from the dangerous predator I had always known into someone younger, more hopeful, more human than I had imagined he could be. 1 month, he agreed, and then he pulled me back into his arms and kissed me again. Slower this time, deeper. A promise and a claim and a beginning all wrapped together, and I let myself sink into it. Let myself believe for this one moment that maybe, just maybe, I wasn't making the biggest mistake of my life. And when his phone rang with what I could tell from his ringtone was an emergency call from his second-in-command, Marco, I felt him tense against me, and saw the transformation as the vulnerable man disappeared, and the calculating Mafia boss reasserted control, and I realized with a thrill of fear and anticipation that my education in exactly who Dante Moretti really was had just begun, and there was no telling whether I would survive the revelation with my heart intact or my conscience clear. 2 weeks into my month-long trial period with Dante, and I found myself standing in the shadowed corner of an underground casino in Brooklyn that definitely didn't have the proper permits or licenses, and probably laundered more money in a single night than most legitimate businesses saw in a year, wearing a black dress that Dante had sent to my apartment with a note that simply said, "Wear this tonight," in his distinctive scrawling handwriting. And I was trying very hard not to think about the fact that the bulge under the jacket of every single man in this room was almost certainly a weapon, and that I was here as something more than Dante's assistant, but something less than his girlfriend, occupying some undefined territory that both thrilled and terrified me in equal measure. His hand was a constant presence on my lower back, possessive and protective, the heat of his palm burning through the thin fabric of my dress as he guided me through the crowd of dangerous men who parted for him like he was royalty, or possibly a shark moving through a school of fish that knew instinctively that survival meant getting out of his way, and I could feel their eyes on me, assessing, calculating, trying to determine what I meant to Dante Moretti and whether I represented a weakness they could exploit, or simply another possession he had acquired to display his power and taste. The past 2 weeks had been a strange dance of intimacy and revelation, nights spent at his penthouse where he would cook for me, because apparently one of the world's most dangerous men had learned to cook from his grandmother and found it meditative, and tell me stories about his childhood in Italy before his father brought the family to New York, about the complicated legacy of violence and honor that he had inherited, about the impossible choices he had made to survive and consolidate power in a world where showing mercy was often interpreted as weakness, and where the cost of trust was frequently paid in blood. We had spent hours talking about everything from philosophy to politics to the ethics of running criminal enterprises in ways that minimized harm to innocent people. And I had watched him wrestle with contradictions in his nature that he had clearly never examined before because no one had ever asked him to justify his choices or consider alternative approaches to problems he had always solved with intimidation and force. And somehow in the process of these conversations I had fallen even deeper into something that I was afraid to call love, but couldn't honestly call anything else because the intensity of what I felt when I looked at him had long since passed the boundaries of mere attraction or fascination. But this was different. This was my first real exposure to the other side of Dante's life, the side that involved negotiations conducted in smoke-filled back rooms with men whose names appeared in FBI databases and whose business dealings would never stand up to scrutiny from any law enforcement agency that wasn't already on their payroll. And I could feel my pulse hammering in my throat as Dante led me deeper into the casino, toward a private room where I could see through the partially open door several men sitting around a table that was covered in papers and what looked like several briefcases full of cash. His hand tightened on my back slightly, a subtle communication that might have been reassurance or warning or simply acknowledgement that he knew I was nervous and wanted me to understand that he would protect me from anything that happened in this room. But protection was a complicated concept when the person protecting you was also the reason you needed protection in the first place. And I was acutely aware that by crossing this threshold, I was moving from observer to participant in Dante's criminal empire in ways that I wouldn't be able to pretend ignorance about if questions were ever asked by authorities. The negotiation itself started civil enough, with Dante introducing me simply as Elena, offering no explanation for my presence or my role, letting the other men draw their own conclusions while he discussed shipping routes and distribution networks and territorial boundaries with the kind of detailed knowledge that came from years of running these operations. And I found myself simultaneously fascinated and horrified by the casual way they discussed activities that would result in decades of prison time if law enforcement ever managed to build a prosecutable case. I watched Dante work, watched the way he controlled the room without raising his voice, the way he used silence as a weapon and eye contact as a form of dominance, the way he could sense when someone was lying or holding back information and would pivot his questions to expose the deception with surgical precision. And I understood in a way I never had before why he was so successful, why men who had spent their entire lives in this world deferred to someone who was relatively young compared to most of the power players in organized crime. It was because he was smarter, more strategic, more willing to evolve with changing circumstances, and absolutely ruthless when ruthlessness was required. The civility shattered when one of the men, an older Italian with scars on his knuckles and dead eyes that suggested he had done things that would haunt most people's nightmares, made a comment about one of Dante's decisions that was clearly intended to challenge his authority and test whether he had gone soft, whether the rumors about him being distracted by a woman, by me, though he didn't say it directly, had any merit. And I felt Dante's entire body tense beside me in a way that made every instinct I possessed scream at me to move away, to get out of the blast radius of whatever was about to happen. The room had gone completely silent, every man present recognizing that a line had been crossed, and that what happened in the next few seconds would determine the power dynamics for possibly months to come. And I watched as Dante released my back and moved around the table, with movements that were so controlled they were almost inhuman. His face completely blank of expression, but his eyes burning with something cold and lethal that made the challenging man actually lean back in his chair, even though he was trying to maintain his aggressive posture. What happened next occurred so fast that I almost couldn't track it. Dante's hand shot out and grabbed the man's wrist in a grip that must have been agonizing based on the way the man's face went white. And then Dante was speaking in rapid Italian that I couldn't fully follow, but which clearly involved threats detailed enough and creative enough that the other men at the table were exchanging glances that suggested they were grateful not to be on the receiving end of Dante's attention. The man tried to pull away, tried to reach for what I realized with a sick lurch in my stomach was a gun tucked into his waistband. But Dante was faster, slamming the man's arm down onto the table with enough force that I heard something crack and the man screamed, and then Dante's other hand was at the man's throat, not squeezing hard enough to cut off air, but positioned in a way that made it clear he could do so at any moment. And his voice, when he finally switched back to English, was so cold and empty of emotion that it was more frightening than if he had been shouting. "You will remember that in my territory, challenging my authority is the same as signing your death warrant," Dante said, and each word was precisely enunciated, delivered with the kind of calm that suggested he was discussing something as mundane as the weather, rather than threatening murder in a room full of witnesses who would never dream of testifying about what they had seen. "You will remember that I have been merciful today in only breaking your wrist rather than putting a bullet in your skull, and you will take that mercy as the gift it is and spend the rest of your considerably shortened life being grateful that I decided your usefulness as an example of my restraint outweighed your usefulness as a corpse." He released the man then, stepping back and smoothing down his jacket as if nothing unusual had happened, and I watched as the man cradled his broken wrist and nodded frantically. His earlier aggression completely evaporated in the face of Dante's casual violence, and I realized that I was shaking, my hands trembling at my sides as I processed what I had just witnessed and tried to reconcile it with the man who had held me so gently 2 nights ago while we watched old movies on his couch. The rest of the meeting concluded quickly after that, with all the men eager to agree to whatever terms Dante proposed and get out of the room before his mood shifted again. And then we were walking back through the casino toward the exit, Dante's hand once again on my lower back, but I could feel that he was still tense, still riding the adrenaline of the confrontation, and I wasn't sure if I should say something or stay quiet or run screaming in the opposite direction, because suddenly, the reality of who he was and what he was capable of felt overwhelmingly immediate rather than abstract knowledge I could compartmentalize. We made it to his car, a black Mercedes with bulletproof glass, and a driver who I suspected was more bodyguard than chauffeur. And Dante held the door open for me with perfect courtesy that seemed absurd, given that we had just left a scene where he had casually broken someone's bones. And once we were both inside and the privacy screen was up, separating us from the driver, he turned to me with an expression that I couldn't read, something that might have been regret or defiance or possibly both. "Now you've seen it," he said, and his voice was carefully neutral, as if he was bracing himself for my rejection, for the inevitable moment when I would realize that the violence wasn't something he did, but something he was, intrinsic to his nature in ways that couldn't be separated or reformed or loved away by someone with good intentions and naive hopes. Now you understand what I meant when I said my world was dark, that being close to me means being exposed to things that most people never see and never should have to see. And I won't blame you if you want to end this experiment before the full month is up, because God knows I would leave me if I had that option. His hand reached out to touch my face, a gesture that was achingly tender considering what those same hands had just done, and I could see conflict written across his features. The desire to pull me closer warring with the conviction that the honorable thing to do would be to push me away, to protect me from himself even if it meant losing the one person who had made him want to be something other than what circumstances and heredity had shaped him into. I was shaking still, tremors running through my body that I couldn't control. But when I examined my feelings, I realized with something like shock that I wasn't afraid of Dante, wasn't repulsed by what I had witnessed even though I absolutely should have been. Instead, I was afraid for him, afraid of the toll that living this way must take on his soul, afraid that the violence and the constant vigilance and the inability to trust anyone would eventually erode whatever humanity he had managed to preserve despite everything. "Kiss me," I said, and my voice came out rough and demanding in a way that surprised both of us, and I saw his eyes widen slightly before something hot and dangerous flared in their depths. "I need you to kiss me right now, Dante, because I need to feel something other than fear and adrenaline and the horrible realization that I'm not running away from you even though every rational part of my brain is screaming that I should be." He didn't need to be told twice, his hands tangling in my hair as he pulled me across the seat toward him. And the kiss was nothing like the tender explorations we had shared over the past 2 weeks. This was desperate and consuming, tasting of violence and need, and the fundamental human drive to affirm life in the face of death. And I kissed him back with equal intensity, pouring 3 years of complicated feelings and 2 weeks of growing attachment and the strange exhilaration of surviving something dangerous into the press of lips and the slide of tongues and the way our bodies strained together despite the awkward confines of the car. When we finally broke apart, we were both breathing hard, and I could see something like wonder in his expression, as if he couldn't quite believe that I was still here, still choosing him despite having seen the monster in action, rather than just hearing about it secondhand or observing it from the safe distance of his office where violence was theoretical rather than visceral. "Take me home," I said, and I watched realization dawn in his eyes as he understood that I meant his home, not my tiny studio in Queens, that I was making a choice to go deeper into this thing between us, rather than retreating to safety and distance and the comfort of denial. "Take me to your penthouse and show me the man underneath the monster. Show me the Dante who reads philosophy at 3 a.m, and who cooks pasta because his grandmother taught him, and who looks at me like I might be the one thing in his entire world that could save him from drowning in darkness." My hands were on his face now, forcing him to maintain eye contact, refusing to let him look away or retreat behind the walls he erected so skillfully when he felt vulnerable. "And then tomorrow I want you to explain to me how you justify what you do, how you live with the violence and the moral compromises and the constant calculation of cost and benefit. Not because I'm judging you, but because I need to understand. Because if I'm going to keep falling for you, and God help me, I am falling for you despite every warning sign and red flag, then I need to understand the reality of your world, rather than just the sanitized version you've been showing me." The drive back to his penthouse was silent, except for the sound of our breathing slowly returning to normal and the way our hands stayed intertwined on the seat between us, fingers laced together in a grip that felt like a lifeline for both of us. And I spent the entire ride trying to process what had happened and what it meant that I had chosen to stay, that I had crossed a line from which there was no returning to the person I had been before. By the time we arrived and rode the elevator up to his floor, the adrenaline was fading and leaving behind a bone-deep exhaustion mixed with a strange electric anticipation. And when we entered his penthouse and he turned to me with a question in his eyes, asking permission, asking if I was sure, asking if I really wanted to take this final step that would bind us together in ways that went beyond the professional or even the romantic into territory that was far more primal and permanent. I found that I didn't need to think about my answer because my body had already made the decision, even if my mind was still catching up. What happened next was a claiming in the truest sense of the word. Dante's hands stripping away my dress with a reverence that contradicted the urgency in his movements. His mouth exploring every inch of exposed skin, as if he was memorizing the taste and texture of me. As if he needed to prove to himself that I was real and present, and choosing this despite everything I had witnessed. I surrendered to the intensity of his attention. Let him worship my body with a dedication that spoke of years of wanting, and weeks of restraint finally being released. And when he finally moved inside me, it felt like something fundamental shifting in the universe. Like we were marking each other in ways that went beyond the physical, into something that might have been spiritual, if I believed in such things. Afterward, wrapped in his arms with the city lights streaming through the windows and his heartbeat steady under my ear, I felt him press a kiss to the top of my head and heard him whisper words in Italian that I didn't understand, but that sounded like prayers, or possibly confessions. And I realized that whatever we had just done had changed both of us irrevocably, had created a bond that would define everything that came after. And when his phone rang hours later with news that the Vitale family had just declared war on the Moretti organization, and that I had been specifically identified as a target because someone had leaked photos of me entering his penthouse, I understood with crystalline clarity that my education in Dante's world was about to accelerate in ways that would test exactly how much I was willing to sacrifice for a man who had warned me from the beginning that loving him would be the most dangerous thing I could possibly do. The morning after Dante received the call about the Vitale family's declaration of war, I woke up to find him standing at the windows of his penthouse, completely naked and seemingly unbothered by his vulnerability, staring out at the city that he controlled in ways that most of its inhabitants would never understand or acknowledge. And even from across the room, I could see the tension in his shoulders, the rigid set of his spine that told me he was already several moves deep into whatever chess game was now playing out between his family and the Vitales, calculating outcomes and contingencies and acceptable losses with the cold precision that had kept him alive and in power for over a decade. I wanted to go to him, to wrap my arms around him from behind, and offer comfort or reassurance or whatever it was that people offered to the men they loved when those men were facing the possibility of a war that could end with bodies in the streets and empires reduced to ash. But something in his posture told me that he had already shifted into the version of himself that couldn't afford the luxury of vulnerability or connection. The version that saw everything and everyone as pieces on a board to be moved or sacrificed according to strategic necessity. And I wasn't sure if that calculus included me as something to be protected at all costs, or something that had become a liability that needed to be managed or eliminated to preserve the larger operation. "You need to disappear for a while," he said without turning around, his voice carrying that flat, emotionless quality that I had learned meant he was operating in pure survival mode. Every decision filtered through the question of what would keep him and his people alive rather than what would make him happy or fulfilled, or any of the softer considerations that normal people got to prioritize in their relationships. "I have a safe house upstate, completely off the grid, where you can stay with a security team until this situation is resolved, and I need you to pack a bag and be ready to leave within the hour, because the Vitales have already proven they know where you live and where you work, and every other place you might go, which means staying in the city is essentially painting a target on your back and waiting for them to take their shot." He finally turned to face me, and I could see that his eyes had gone cold and distant, the warmth and passion from the night before completely buried under layers of tactical thinking and threat assessment. And I felt something in my chest tighten painfully, because I was seeing in real time what it meant to be with someone whose first priority would always be survival and power, rather than love or connection, or any of the things that I had been raised to believe were the foundation of meaningful relationships. But I hadn't spent 2 weeks learning about Dante's world, and the past night surrendering to the intensity of what we felt for each other, just to run and hide the moment things became dangerous. And I found myself standing up from the bed and crossing to where he stood, completely aware that I was also naked, and that this conversation was happening in a state of physical vulnerability that somehow made the emotional stakes feel even higher. "No," I said, and I watched surprise flicker across his face because apparently in his world, people didn't refuse direct orders from Dante Moretti, especially not when those orders were clearly designed to keep them safe from very real and immediate threats. "If I'm in your world, then I'm in it. I don't get to retreat to safety whenever things get uncomfortable or dangerous, and you don't get to make unilateral decisions about my life just because you're used to controlling every variable and every person in your orbit." I saw his jaw tighten, saw the conflict playing out behind his eyes, as the part of him that wanted to protect me warred with the part that respected strength and defiance, and I pressed my advantage before he could formulate whatever argument he was constructing. "The Vitales made me a target because they think I'm your weakness, something they can use to hurt you or control you or force you into making strategic mistakes, and if I run away and hide, I'm just confirming that assessment and giving them exactly the leverage they want to exploit." The silence that stretched between us was charged with tension and unspoken communication, both of us engaged in a battle of wills that would determine the fundamental parameters of our relationship moving forward. And I could see him wrestling with the unprecedented situation of someone he cared about refusing to accept his protection and actually volunteering to put themselves in greater danger for what I suspected he saw as abstract principles about autonomy and partnership that had no practical value in the brutal calculus of survival in his world. "You don't understand what you're asking," he finally said, and his voice had gone rough with emotion that he was clearly struggling to suppress, the careful control slipping just enough that I could see the terror underneath, the bone-deep fear of losing someone who had become essential to him in ways that threatened the emotional distance he had maintained for his entire adult life. "The Vitales don't make empty threats, and if they've specifically identified you as a target, that means they're already planning something, already have people in place to make a move, and I will not, sit back and watch while they hurt you to get to me, because that's a price I'm not willing to pay regardless of what it costs me strategically, or how much it undermines my position to show that kind of weakness." What I did next was possibly the most reckless thing I had done in a lifetime of generally cautious and well-considered decisions. But I found myself reaching up to cup his face in my hands, forcing him to look directly at me rather than at whatever nightmare scenarios were playing out in his strategic mind. And I spoke with a conviction that surprised even me given how terrified I actually was underneath the bravado. "Then use me as bait," I said. And I watched his eyes widen with what looked like genuine horror, as if I had suggested something so beyond the pale that even his criminal mind couldn't immediately process it. "Let the Vitales think they can get to you through me. Set up a situation where they make their move and you're ready for it. And end this before it becomes a prolonged war that costs you resources and people and possibly your life. Because I'm not interested in watching you fight this battle from the sidelines while wondering if every phone call is going to be someone telling me that you didn't survive the latest ambush or assassination attempt." I could feel him trembling slightly under my hands, could see the way his control was fracturing under the combined assault of fear for my safety and recognition that what I was proposing actually made tactical sense even though it violated every protective instinct he possessed. And I knew that I was asking him to do something that went against his fundamental nature, asking him to deliberately put in danger the one thing he had admitted he cared about more than his empire or his life. The argument that followed was explosive and desperate, with Dante pacing the penthouse like a caged predator, while he explained in graphic detail all the ways that my plan could go wrong, all the scenarios where I could end up dead or worse, while he watched helplessly because the Vitales were professionals who wouldn't make obvious mistakes that he could exploit. And I stood my ground and countered every objection with logic and strategy that I had learned from watching him work, pointing out that his organization had resources and intelligence networks that could make the trap nearly foolproof if he was willing to overcome his emotional investment in my safety and treat this like any other tactical problem that required a creative solution. We went back and forth for what felt like hours, our voices rising and falling as we fought about control and trust, and what it meant to be partners rather than protector and protected. And somewhere in the middle of the argument, I realized that this was actually the most honest we had ever been with each other, stripping away all pretense and performance to engage in a fundamental negotiation about who we were going to be together, and whether we could actually find a way to reconcile my need for agency with his need for control in a relationship that was already operating under impossible constraints. By the time the sun had fully risen and was streaming through the windows in golden shafts that illuminated the destruction of our night together, sheets tangled on the floor, wine glasses abandoned on tables, clothes scattered in a trail from the door to the bedroom, Dante had reluctantly agreed to a modified version of my plan, one that involved me wearing a wire and being surrounded by his best people, while we created an opportunity for the Vitales to make their move in a controlled environment where he could eliminate the threat without triggering a larger war that would destabilize the entire criminal ecosystem of the eastern seaboard. I could see that the decision was costing him something essential, that by agreeing to use me as bait, he was violating every principle his father had taught him about keeping the people you cared about separated from the violence of business. But I could also see a grudging respect in his eyes when he looked at me, a recognition that I was strong enough to stand beside him in his world rather than being sheltered from it. And when he pulled me into his arms and whispered against my hair that if anything happened to me he would burn the entire city to the ground and salt the earth where it stood, I believed him completely, and found that the intensity of his devotion was somehow more romantic than any conventional declaration of love could ever be, even as it terrified me to understand exactly what I had become to him and what he was willing to destroy in my name. The gallery opening where we had decided to spring our trap on the Vitales was one of those pretentious Manhattan affairs where people who had more money than taste congregated to pretend they understood contemporary art, while really just networking and being seen in the right places with the right people. And I stood near a sculpture that looked like someone had welded random pieces of metal together and called it genius, wearing a wire that was so sophisticated I couldn't even feel it against my skin, and surrounded by what appeared to be normal gallery patrons, but were actually Dante's most trusted security operatives, positioned at every exit and vantage point. I could hear Dante's voice in my earpiece, low and controlled, but with an undercurrent of barely leashed violence that told me he was watching the security feeds from a van 2 blocks away, and second-guessing every aspect of this plan that he had only agreed to because I had refused to give him any other option, and I found myself touching the small pendant at my throat, a gift he had given me that morning, a saint's medal that had belonged to his grandmother, as if the weight of it could somehow transfer his strength and certainty into my trembling hands and racing heart. When Marco Vitale finally approached me, he was exactly as I had imagined he would be from Dante's descriptions and the intelligence files I had studied obsessively for the past 3 days. Handsome in a cold, aristocratic way that spoke of old money and older bloodlines, impeccably dressed in a suit that probably cost more than most people's cars, and carrying himself with the kind of arrogant confidence that came from never having faced real consequences for his actions, because his family name and his willingness to employ violence had always been enough to make problems disappear. "Elena Martinez," he said, my name rolling off his tongue with a familiarity that made my skin crawl, because it meant he had been studying me just as intensively as I had been studying him, learning my patterns and my vulnerabilities, and all the ways he might exploit my connection to Dante for maximum damage. Dante's little pet, his secretary who somehow managed to capture the attention of a man who's been through more beautiful women than most people meet in their entire lives. I have to admit, I'm curious about what makes you so special, what you offer that all those models and actresses and socialites couldn't provide. I maintained my composure even though every instinct I possessed was screaming at me to run or fight or do anything except stand here making polite conversation with a man who had explicitly threatened to kill me as a way of hurting Dante. And I could hear through my earpiece the string of Italian curses that Dante was muttering as he watched this interaction play out, his control fraying with every second that Marco stood too close to me and looked at me with eyes that were calculating exactly how much pain my death would cause the man he wanted to destroy. Perhaps it's because I see him as a person, rather than a monster or a business opportunity, I said, keeping my voice level and conversational, even though my heart was hammering so hard I was sure Marco could see my pulse jumping in my throat. Or perhaps it's because I'm not intimidated by powerful men who use fear and violence as substitutes for actual intelligence or strategic thinking. I watched his eyes narrow at the insult, watched the mask of civility slip just enough to reveal the violence underneath, and I knew that I was playing an incredibly dangerous game by provoking him. But I also knew that angry people made mistakes, and mistakes were what we needed if this trap was going to work. The conversation deteriorated rapidly after that, with Marco dropping all pretense of pleasantry to make it clear that he knew exactly who I was and what I meant to Dante, and that he fully intended to use me to break the man who had apparently humiliated his family in some business dealing that had cost them territory and respect and the fear that kept their empire running smoothly. I felt his hand close around my arm with bruising force as he started to steer me toward a side exit that definitely wasn't part of the gallery's normal layout, and I heard Dante's voice in my ear transition from Italian cursing to clipped tactical commands as he directed his people to intercept. But Marco had apparently anticipated this possibility, because suddenly there were more men moving through the gallery than should have been possible. More weapons being drawn. And I realized with a sick lurch in my stomach that we had underestimated the Vitale's resources and their willingness to create a bloodbath in a public space if it meant achieving their objective. What happened next was chaos and violence and the kind of primal terror that comes from understanding that you might actually die in the next few minutes. And I felt myself being dragged toward a service elevator, while gunfire erupted behind us, and people screamed and scattered. And then suddenly Dante was there, not watching from a safe distance, but physically present, and absolutely lethal, moving through Marco's guards like they were nothing more than inconvenient obstacles between him and the thing he valued most in the world. I had never seen him like this, had never witnessed the full extent of what he was capable of when every restraint and calculation was stripped away and replaced with pure, protective rage. And I watched as he eliminated the men holding me with an efficiency that was beautiful and terrible in equal measure. And when Marco tried to use me as a human shield, tried to press a gun to my temple and negotiate his escape, Dante's shot was so perfectly placed that it grazed Marco's shoulder and forced his grip to loosen just enough for me to wrench myself free and stumble into Dante's arms. The aftermath was a blur of police sirens and carefully orchestrated stories that Dante's lawyers and paid officials would ensure matched the official narrative. But all I could focus on was the way Dante was holding me like I might disappear if he loosened his grip even slightly. The way his hands were shaking as they moved over my body, checking for injuries. The way his voice broke when he whispered my name over and over like a prayer, or possibly a curse directed at himself for allowing me to be in danger in the first place. We ended up back at his penthouse hours later, after giving statements that were carefully crafted to present us as innocent victims of a business rivalry gone wrong, and I found myself standing in his bathroom while he cleaned the minor cuts and bruises I had sustained. His touch so gentle it made my chest ache. And when I looked up and met his eyes in the mirror, I saw something in them that I had never seen before. Complete and utter vulnerability, the kind of exposed emotional honesty that he had spent his entire life learning to hide because showing it meant giving people weapons to hurt him. "I love you," he said, and the words came out rough and uncertain, as if he wasn't sure he was using them correctly because they were so foreign to his vocabulary, so antithetical to everything he had been taught about power and survival and the necessity of emotional distance. "I love you more than I love power or money or the empire my father built, more than I love my own life. And that's terrifying, because loving something that much means it can be used to destroy you. But I can't pretend anymore that what I feel for you is anything less than complete and total devotion that would make me burn down everything I've built, if that's what it took to keep you safe." His hands cupped my face, tilting my head back so I had no choice but to look directly into eyes that were usually so controlled and calculating but were now raw with emotion that he had clearly been holding back for weeks, or possibly months, or maybe even years. So I need you to tell me right now if you can live with this, if you can accept that loving me means living in a world where violence is always a possibility, and where I will make choices that your conscience might struggle with, because I can't lose you now that I've found you. Can't go back to the empty existence I had before you walked into my office and threw that coffee cup and made me realize that I was only half alive. My answer was to kiss him with everything I had been feeling, but couldn't articulate. 3 years of complicated attraction, and 2 weeks of falling in love, and 1 night of surrendering completely, and today's terror of almost losing him, all poured into the desperate press of lips, and the way our bodies moved together, as if they had been designed specifically for this purpose. And when we finally made it to his bed, the connection between us felt different than it had before. Deeper, more permanent, marked by the understanding that we had both made irrevocable choices that would define the rest of our lives. Yes, I whispered against his mouth, answering questions he had asked and questions he hadn't, but that hung between us nonetheless. Yes to all of it, to your darkness and your light, to your violence and your unexpected tenderness, to standing beside you as your partner rather than being protected and sheltered, to being yours completely if you'll be mine in the same way, without reservations or escape routes or the careful emotional distance you've maintained your entire life. 3 months later, I stood in Dante's office at Moretti Industries, but I was no longer his secretary, or even his personal assistant. I was his partner in every sense of the word, managing the legitimate business operations while he handled the less legal aspects of the empire. And together we had transformed how the Moretti family operated, reducing unnecessary violence while actually increasing both profit and influence through strategic thinking, and the kind of innovative approaches that came from combining his deep knowledge of the underworld with my business education and my complete inability to accept "that's how we've always done it" as a valid reason for anything. The criminal world had initially been skeptical of my influence, but after I had orchestrated a takeover of 3 rival operations using nothing but financial manipulation and strategic information leaks, they had started calling me La Regina, the Queen, and treating me with the same wary respect they showed Dante, understanding that we were a unit now, that threatening one of us meant going to war with both, and that together we were more formidable than either of us could have been separately. My mother's medical bills were a distant memory now, handled so completely that she would never have to worry about money again, even though she still believed I was simply a very successful executive assistant who had been promoted into management. And I had finally been able to finish my MBA and apply the knowledge in ways that the professors who taught those classes would probably be horrified to learn about, but which had nevertheless resulted in measurable improvements in how Dante's organization functioned. We had just returned from a meeting where Dante had proposed to me, not in some romantic restaurant or scenic overlook, but in the middle of a negotiation with another crime family, sliding a black diamond ring across the table and asking me in front of witnesses, who would spread the story throughout the underworld if I would marry him and officially become his queen, in title as well as function. And I had said yes without hesitation, because by that point there was nothing ambiguous about our relationship or my place in his world. Now, standing in his office where this had all begun with a thrown coffee cup and years of suppressed feelings finally exploding into honesty, I found myself smiling at the memory of that morning and everything that had happened since. And when Dante came up behind me and wrapped his arms around my waist, pulling me back against his chest, while we both looked out at the city that we controlled together, I felt a sense of rightness that I had never experienced in all my years of trying to do everything correctly and follow all the rules that society prescribed for people like me. "Any regrets?" he murmured against my ear, his lips brushing the sensitive skin there in a way that still made me shiver, even after months of intimacy. "Any moments where you wish you had run instead of staying? Where you think about what your life might have been like if you had made different choices that morning?" I turned in his arms so I could look directly at him, so he could see the absolute certainty in my eyes when I answered, because after everything we had been through together, he deserved nothing less than complete honesty about where we stood. "I came to your office as a desperate secretary drowning in debt and exhaustion," I said, reaching up to trace the line of his jaw with my fingers, feeling the slight stubble there and the tension that never quite left his body even in moments of peace. "And I threw a coffee cup in anger because I couldn't stand watching you waste your humanity on meaningless conquests when I could see glimpses of something better underneath all the violence and control." I smiled at the memory, at how far we had both come from those people we had been just a few months ago. And somehow I walked out as the queen of the underworld, loved by a man who would burn down empires for me and who lets me see every part of him. The monster and the man, the violence and the vulnerability, the darkness that he was born into, and the light that he's trying to create despite everything working against him. I pulled him down for a kiss that was tender and claiming an equal measure, a reaffirmation of everything we had chosen and everything we would continue to choose every day for the rest of our lives. They say be careful what you wish for, that sometimes getting what you want is the worst thing that can happen to you. But I've learned that sometimes the dangerous wish is exactly what your soul needs. Not despite the risk, but because of it. Because real love isn't safe or comfortable or easy. It's two people seeing each other completely and choosing each other anyway. Building something beautiful and terrible together in a world that tells them it's impossible. And finding that the impossibility is what makes it worth having.